talk to you about the fact that the Australian government's guidance for those who are reporting under the Act make it clear that businesses should be applying the UN guiding principles on business and human rights in their response to modern slavery and how they respond to the Act, so how they report. Now, these principles, the so-called UNGPs, were introduced in 2011, and they're the current global authoritative standard on preventing and addressing business-related human rights harms. So we're talking about all human rights here, but including labour rights and including modern slavery. So the UNGPs say that businesses, including investors, have a responsibility to respect human rights. And this means they should avoid infringing on the rights of others. That might be their workers, it might be the workers in their supply chains, it might be the human rights of the people in the communities where they operate. And the UNGPs say that businesses meet this responsibility in practice by having a policy commitment to respecting human rights, by undertaking ongoing human rights due diligence to identify, prevent and mitigate harms, and by remediating the harms that they're involved with. And the expectations around remediation depend on the level of involvement with the harm. Now, I'm going to come back to this because the government's guidance for those reporting under the Modern Slavery Act says that when the reporting criteria ask businesses to describe their due diligence or their remediation, it means this process of human rights due diligence and remediation outlined in the UN guiding principles. So the UNGPs are also very clear that there are differing levels of expectation around these steps. If you're a large business, if you're a multinational, or if, for example, you're a small, you're an SME. And one quick note before we move to human rights due diligence in particular, I want to flag that the UNGPs are increasingly reflected in laws globally, like our Modern Slavery Act, but they're also being incorporated into corporate policies, into industry standards, into benchmarks. They're being referenced by investors and even in litigation. So now I'd like to move on to that concept of human rights due diligence and look at how the CAF certification process really supports businesses in undertaking it. So this is a bit of a busy slide, but basically I wanted to look at how, look at the human rights due diligence process and take you through the steps. So human rights due diligence, as I mentioned, is an ongoing process to identify, prevent and mitigate human rights harms, including in supply chains. So it's really a risk management process, but the focus of this one is risk to people rather than risk to business, although those risks will often align. And so I've set out the 4 steps in human rights due diligence and also remediation on the left column. And these steps also align to some extent to the Modern Slavery Act reporting criteria. And then in the right column, I've highlighted at a very high level my personal view on how the CAF certification process supports businesses to conduct human rights due diligence in relation to those potential labour rights risks in their supply chains when it comes to the cleaning industry. So I don't have time to go through everything on the slide here, but I'm going to go through each step and pull out a few key points. So the first step of human rights due diligence asks businesses to identify and other entities to identify and assess where their most severe human rights risks and impacts lie. So the UNGPs say this process should be regular, it should draw on expertise, and it needs to be informed by meaningful consultation with workers or other potentially affected people. So the CAF certification process, of course, brings specialised expertise focused on cleaning to identify labour rights risks. And as we've discussed, the risk identification relating to substandard working conditions is ongoing. It's not just done at a single point in time. And then a really, I think, unique part of CAF is there's this really ongoing and meaningful consultation with cleaners and the union to identify those risk areas and to identify issues in their work early. And this is that elevation of worker voice, which we really look for in the business and human rights space. Now, the second step, which is on the left-hand column, is integrating and acting on findings by taking steps to manage risks. And the CAF certification process helps manage risk in a range of ways. So importantly, it's involving all stakeholders in the supply chain, from the building owners to the cleaners. And there's a range of controls, of course, including the tender pricing, contractual clauses. We have education of stakeholders throughout the supply chain. We know that CAF uses social audits, but also recognises that those audits alone are not sufficient. They tend to just reflect a snapshot of a single point in time. And this is a big topic in the business and human rights area at the moment. So CAF also has ongoing compliance checks, unscheduled spot checks, and multiple avenues and formal points for worker feedback. So again, keeping that worker voice at the centre of the risk management process. Now, the third step on that left-hand column is tracking your efforts. Is what you're doing effective? So CAF certification tracks progress, of course, against the 3-star standard. But as we've discussed, there's multiple formal avenues for ongoing feedback about the efforts underway. And one area at the moment where many modern slavery statements are reporting on is they're reporting on their efforts, and they're focusing on the process and quantitative aspects of their efforts. So, for example, they're saying we've trained this many people, we changed these policies, we've changed these clauses in our contracts. But there's much less reporting on that qualitative aspect. So what are the impacts on the ground for workers? And I think this is another unique point that CAF really brings to the fore, which is CAF is able to bring that feedback from workers about how CAF certification is changing things on the ground. And so that links to the 4th step, which is communicating with stakeholders about how the business is addressing human rights impacts. So, of course, you can point to CAF in a modern slavery statement or other business sustainability reporting. And I think importantly, CAF can help you craft a case study, for example, for your modern slavery statement, which talks about, perhaps we identify these issues or these risks and they were rectified in this way, or we remediated them in this way. And those sort of case studies are what some of the benchmarking around modern slavery are really looking for. And finally, because I know I'm running out of time, the UNGPs ask that businesses remediate harms that they're involved with. So CAF facilitates really trusted and accessible channels for making complaints and raising issues, and also facilitates remediation of issues identified. So that's our whirlwind tour of human rights due diligence and how the CAF certification process helps support businesses undertake it. And thank you very much for listening. I'll leave this last slide due to time.